Because in addition to this being a time of crisis in terms of war and famine and cold, cold, cold weather, lots of rain, lots of serious weather events, this is also the time of the Black Death, but it's also the time of the rise of the humanist movement and the Renaissance, a kind of quickening of cultural forms. In the midst of all this devastation and despair, we get a massive amount of artistic and cultural output. We get a literary tradition really developing around the humanists. It's going to be both an exciting and frightening time. And one of the things that was exciting about this time was the exposure that the Golden Horde had brought to the Western world, to Eastern goods and to Eastern texts and to Eastern systems of knowledge. We already saw that the way that the horseshoe was able to create a massive kind of commercial quickening in the agricultural sector. The Golden Horde brought with them also, though rather likely, the Black Death. It's very possible that that the Black Death was brought on a flea on the back of a rat that traveled with the Golden Horde, though it's hard to say one way or the other. One thing that we do know, though, is that the Golden Horde reintroduced a number of Eastern texts that had been kind of lost, especially Greek texts from that Hellenistic period that we were discussing before, when we had the Gandharian Buddhas, right, that reflected the aesthetic norms of the Greek world in synthesis with the aesthetic norms of the Asian world, the Southeast Asian world. And we're going to see these kind of reemerge. We're also going to see the trade opened up, form the backbone of some of those 100 Years' War and trade wars that we were talking about before. That trade is really going to open up brand new avenues of money, and it's going to be a contentious thing, most especially because of the arrival of the Ottoman Empire. The Seljuk Turks had invaded and been somewhat successful in mopping up the disastrous fragmentation of the caliphates. Those competing caliphates had been slowly fragmenting, especially under the weight of the Crusades, trade wars, and a growing Christian anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic viewpoint that we saw, especially expressed in the Reconquisto. Now, the Ottomans were able to mop up after the Seljuks, who had mopped up after the caliphates, and they were able to take advantage of some of the disasters of the trade wars, especially those felt in the Byzantine world and in Byzantine holdings, and establish themselves as a power base, especially along the Mediterranean in the North African corridor and in the Sinai Peninsula. As we can see here, we see this kind of massive expansion. In one place that's really going to feel this the most is the Byzantine Empire, which is really going to meet its end at the hand of the Ottomans. The Ottomans sack Constantinople, that first Christian capital in the West, and it becomes Istanbul. This is a brand new thing, and it's pretty nightmarish to a lot of the Christian world. They see this as yet another sign that God is punishing them, yes. But as much as the Ottomans were disastrous for the Greek Orthodox world, and the empires they had created thus before, and for parts of the caliphate, they also promoted learning and culture and literary development. And it is from them that we're going to see the reintroduction of Greek and Roman texts lost to history because they were not supportive of a Christian world because they were pagan texts and they were obviously pagan texts. And this was an uncomfortable thing for Christians, especially when we had the Middle Ages occurring, right? Christians really disliked the notion of these kinds of pagan texts, but we're going to see these reintroduced and we're going to see them reappropriated as not pagan texts in interesting and unique manners. And we're going to see them form the backbone of the humanist and Renaissance movements. Because really, war was happening everywhere. It was happening in the Ottoman world, but it was happening in Europe. And this meant some major changes in the way life and livelihoods were made. And we're going to see exposure to other cultures be both exciting and devastating at the same time. Because the cities had been growing, and the problem with growing cities and the problem with the conditions created by multiple years of warfare, the problem with a massive famine created by a downturn in the temperature is all going to kind of come together. It's going to suffuse to create the perfect conditions for the perfect storm on a viral level in the form of the Black Death. Now, the Black Death was likely a series of viruses and bacteria all kind of occurring together. Why do we know that? Because certain symptoms that we see reported in primary texts, they show some interesting physical phenomenon that we see in a bacteria here, but then we'll also see the kind of phenomenon we see in a virus here on the same person. What do we do with that? Well, one kind of emerging group of historians out there in the historical world are people looking at science and history together and in tandem. And one kind of movement that we've seen come out of that is epidemiological history, the study of epidemics, using both historical and scientific tools and methods. And we see this with David Herlihy's The Black Death, which is recommended in your further reading, where he kind of looks at this virus and he says that and he looks at different articles by different historians in the field who look at this, and he proposes that it is a combination of Yersinia pestis, the who travels on the backs of fleas that then attach themselves to rats or other livestock. And those fleas basically carry the virus on their backs. And then we also see the bubonic plague, which creates those big black buboes, those big disgusting circular sores that are very painful that form along the glands. So you'd see them in the armpits, along the neck, along the inner thighs. That's where you're going to see them forming. And the formation of the buboes means that the Black Death is going to take you out very, very soon, usually within a 24 to 48 hour period by what we see in the records. It's likely, though, that we also see a couple of viruses and bacterial infections that happen because of immunocompromised status in sufferers. So if you have a virus for long enough, you see other things occurring, like, for example, if you get the cold virus and your cold lasts for too long, it can become walking pneumonia, or it can become bronchitis. The same is true for bubonic plague and that bacteria phase, Yersinia pestis, going on to compromise the immune system enough for the septicemic and pneumonic viruses to take hold in a compromised immune system, because they require compromised immune systems to thrive. And that's what produces people having kind of black bile coming out of their mouth, because their internal organs are basically liquefying. That's how you get people with who basically drown before they die of fever or internal organ breakdown. they would die of drowning, basically because their lungs would fill up with fluid because of the extreme conditions that their immune systems are put under. Now, we do have a number of sources, and many of these sources are coming out of a rising doctor class that we're going to discuss here in a moment. But the problem is that at a time like this, when there's already so much disorder caused by civil and international and religious strife, you add to that the addition of this really devastating virus, a virus that killed off, or disease, we can call it disease because it's a number of things, but this killed off an estimated 60% of the population of the Western world. 60% of the population. I mean, just think about that. Is an epidemic of a massive scale, and it's difficult for us to understand from our perspective just the weight of that when you watch these, like, popular zombie movies and television shows, that kind of end of the world feeling that you get there, the desperation. You see that at this time, and it makes it difficult for us as historians to study some parts of this time because there's a lot of confusion in the sources, because it's a tumultuous time period. So we have kind of multiple disease theories, and there's even some people who throw out that other illnesses became involved again because it was a compromised immune situation, and you had people who were starving, living in cold weather conditions in filthy cities, overpopulated by people, and all of these things together create the perfect conditions for the growth of other things like tuberculosis, anthrax, smallpox, and consumption, all of which may have been culprits as part of this larger Black Death. It should be noted that there were multiple outbreaks of the Black Death. The Black Death would last for about 7 to 10 years each time. It would be a massive die-off, and then it would cyclically go underground for about another 7 to 10 years because this is likely the cycle of the virus. And then it would pop back up again, and then you'd see another massive outbreak. So we see this cyclically occurring. And the last reported circumstance of the Black Death was in Calcutta in 1857. So this is the last time that we see the Black Death. So it's all the way from the 1300s, well, really the 1200s if you account for some early reports, which some people do and some people don't, all the way until the 1800s. And that's pretty massive, guys. It's pretty massive. But what that's going to lead to is a lot of social disruption. It's going to mean that there's going to be massive migrations. People are going to leave the countryside, people are going to leave the city, and they're going to attempt to go places where they believe the disease is not. And whether or not they find the disease there when they arrive, we see massive migrations. Those looser vassalage systems that we're talking about and the devastation of the 100 Years' War is all going to compound to create massive movements of people from one place to another. We're going to see a smaller population though, and strangely enough, that's going to create some good conditions for people. We're going to see that massive inflation that's been building up for the past few years really be kiboshed by the smaller population. We're going to see more jobs available to people, so it's a better world for employment than it was in the overpopulated world of the 12th century. We're going to see better wages for people, and we're going to see lower rents for people. So we're going to see a higher standard of living for people in certain areas. Though there's places where this is more true than others. In the far north, especially in parts of Germany, this is certainly not true, and you can see that reflected in our peasant wars. But this is going to have an effect on the 15th and 16th century in the way kind of new commercial and economic forms egress from the changes wrought by 60% of the population dying off. And we're also going to see a lot of technical advancement that comes out because people are trying to treat it, understand it, And this, gets attached to that rising university system, but it also gets attached to a new class of people, the doctor class. And we're going to talk about them here a little bit more in this lecture. This new kind of rise of a new kind of idea of science and medicine in a practical and application-based situation, instead of just being learned men who went to the Studium Particulare and they went to Salerno to get their degree because they're a master now of the sciences. Like, a lot of those guys are dead. And it costs money to make more, and you have to send them to other towns and cities. And what happens if that city is being currently infected by the Black Death? You're not going to send somebody there. So we're going to see new people rise up to take the place of these former medicine men. And you're going to see a lot more everyday medicine, medicine administered to people of multiple classes. But really, all in all, we're going to see a drastic shift in people's religious beliefs, in their social practices, and their cultural institutions, and the way that they behave. Really, this is a psychological, it's hard to really put into words how psychologically traumatizing an event like this would be. And it's certainly going to change a whole number of things in the Western world. And here we can see the major extent of that first outbreak, the first major outbreak of the Black Death. Some people say that all the way down in the late 1200s there was an outbreak, but there's some argument about that on either side. At the very least, we can say that these are the locations of major outbreaks and the way they traveled from one location to another via popular trade routes. Trade routes were one way that these things traveled. Routes used by soldiers to travel from one battle location to another were ways that this virus traveled. And we're going to see it break out all over this Western world. And there's very few people who are saved from it. But as we discussed earlier, whole parts of the Arabic world and the African world did not have such dense or ridiculous an exposure to this virus, likely because of their better bathing practices, because of the fact that they were already using a form of vaccination, as we talked about before. All the way back in the 7th century, we see the first real person from Europe writing about vaccinations in Damascus and in Syria. And I mean, when we talk about that psychological damage, we can really see this performed best in a new kind of cultural form of art, in literature, and just of an idea, the danse macabre. The danse macabre basically got at this notion that death comes for us all, and oftentimes in danse macabre paintings and literature, we see this phrase, death comes for all. It comes for the rich, it comes for the poor. And it walks the streets every day and every night. And you start to see this reflected in paintings of skeletons doing everyday activities. Usually they're in some kind of state of revelry. The idea is that death has won. Death is waging a massive rager on the earth. It's one big kegger for death, and this is the best party ever. And you see this as a reflection of the trauma created by such massive die-offs and cultural shifts. And we see that even in building forms, where we see that people don't even know what to do with bodies. I would super recommend Philip Airy's series, Western Attitudes Towards Death, where he really talks about the Black Death as a pivotal moment when we have to change the way we deal with the sick and with the dead, because now they are dangerous to us. They are dangerous to our condition as living people, and even people in the 13th century understood that the bodies of the dead were spreading disease. They could see that in the world around them. They didn't need microscopes and fancy talk like we see on medical dramas to understand that. So what do we do with all of these bodies? Well, one popular thing to do would be to put them in a pit and cover them with lye. It would be consecrated, so they'd be all right. And the lye would melt down the fat in in the skin and in the fatty cells and in the muscles, etc., whilst keeping the bone intact. Now, you could also boil bones, as was the popular method in Poland. And perhaps you're like, well, it's hard for us to get a churchman out to consecrate a pit outside of town. So what do? We melt down those bodies and we take the bones and we build churches with them and holy ground. So if you build that into the church basement or build it into the edifice of the church, as we see in Poland and in ossuaries in southern France and in parts of Italy and in Hungary, we see these ossuaries, these temples built of bones, which consecrates the dead at the same time that it kind of takes care of what to do with them, which does in fact become a logistical issue during the Black Death. Now, flagellants were another expression of the psychological trauma of the Black Death. As we discussed, there's all these things happening at the same time. We have the Great Schism, the Avignon Papacy, all of these things, in addition to secular rulers propagandizing and kidnapping major religious leaders in the church, trying them for treason, etc., people really start to believe that the Black Death is a punishment for the worldliness that had been introduced in the past few years. And nobody believed this more than the flagellants, who, in order to atone for the sins of man, would go from town to town, whipping themselves and abusing themselves in order to try to secure, as Jesus did with his own passion and punishment, forgiveness for mankind and an end to our suffering. So flagellants were a big show, though. When they would come through town, people would flock out to the streets to see them. This was an event, and people hoped that they could do the things that they said they could do, because if they did, it would be such a much more wonderful world. So people wanted the flagellants to be right. Unfortunately, though, one thing that kind of stinks when you're trying to keep a disease from spreading is to have a bunch of people moving from multiple locations that have that disease breaking out, whipping themselves and throwing their blood via the whips that they're using all over all the people who have gathered to see them. See, because that's what they would do. They would whip their backs and then they would flail it forward, flail it back. That whole time you've got blood spraying out into this captive audience of believers, likely praying with their faces turned upward to God, muttering prayers, perhaps blood from these flagellants flying into their mouth. You cannot imagine a more conspicuous arrangement to spread disease. So the flagellants, as much as they're trying to save the world from itself, perhaps might have themselves been integral in the spread of the disease. But one thing that rose out of this disease was a brand new class of people, and it wasn't just that they rose out of the Black Death, they rose out of the 100 Years' War as well. There needed to be doctors on the battlefield, and there just weren't enough surgeons. There weren't enough of the fancy guys. The masters that had studied at Salerno or Bologna, right, at these major universities. These were the guys that could treat the rich. But there's the thing is, death's danse macabre, my friends. Death came for everyone. Death came for everyone. It walked the earth, and that meant that it came for rich people trained for 10 years in Salerno under the Studium Particulare just as much as they did for everybody else. Just to get someone for your local area, you would choose somebody from your population, from your village, your town, your city, maybe a few someones, and you would patron their movement through school, and when they came back, they would have that position so they could see and treat people. However, that was very much a part of the social hierarchy. There's many people who did not get treatment, and for many years people relied on monks, nuns, and holy men and women who were viewed to have some magical gift of healing. Now, the 100 Years' War had made it necessary to have people who had enough training to do something that was very popular in that war, as it is in every war, to take off limbs in the battlefield and not kill people, because amputation is a big part of warfare. In each and every war throughout time, you see multiple people suffering under the conditions of amputeeism. Now, you need to have people who are trained enough to be able to do that procedure out on the battlefield, but you don't want to wait 10 years to have them, cook up fully at the university. So we see the rise of the doctors, and the doctors got even more validity as some of the only people who went to administer and to document the conditions of people suffering under the Black Death, because many surgeons didn't want to go near people suffering from Black Death. They knew that they were contagious, so they didn't want to go near them. Now, these plague doctors would outfit themselves to try to keep the plague from affecting them. They would wear these leather masks that are really creepy and cool looking and look like something out of a comic book. Don't they look like something out of a comic book? And these hats, the leather hat that were in the glass eyes so they could still see through, but wouldn't be exposed to any blood or any fluids of any kind, but also to the idea of air, because what they would do is in those masks, they would put a poultice of certain herbs, flowers, and spices that were said to be medicinal. Some of this came from Ottoman lore. Some of this also came from popular ideas of poppies, especially, and posies, which were thought to have the power to deflect the Black Death because of their religious symbolic significance. And that's where we get pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, ring around the rosies, pocket full of posies. The pocket full of posies would be what people would hold to their face if they're going someplace where they saw people who were sick. The doctors had them inside of their masks, and they believed that they would ward off the disease. They would have a wooden stick to keep people away should people try to, because sometimes people would get very desperate and that could be a problem. They didn't want to be infected. They would have the full gown, and they had leather breeches and then cotton breeches under that. And one interesting little factor of doctors in the Black Death is that they made knickers a very popular phenomenon for much of the Western world, which is why we see more and more people wearing undergarments, underwear, something that came to be to keep the Black Death at bay, but then became a fashion and fadism. Now, the Black Death, in addition to causing quite a lot of psychological trauma, could not really stop in its tracks, something that had been developing for some time. We talked about this a little bit with Abelard and Heloise and the rise of the university system. We know that the Ottomans and the Golden Horde are bringing in new texts that people haven't seen before. We know that the golden age of the Umayyad dynasty brought paper to the West. We're going to see that mix with the printing press very, very soon here. And what that's going to form the backbone for is a humanist movement, a movement that looks to linguistics, to translating other languages, including languages that early biblical texts were written in. This is going to be very important for the Reformation and the Catholic Reformation that we see in chapters 14 and 15. We're going to see a Latin revival in an attempt to reform the vernacular Latin that we'd kind of been discussing in the last couple of chapters. We remember that Latin got a little bit creative because it was being used in everyday speech, and everyday speech means slang, and slang does help a language to grow, but it also means that, you know, you're going to be breaking the rules a bit more. Now, one interesting thing is that attempts by writers like Petrarch and Pico and Cicero is that their insistence that Latin be reformed and brought back into line with ancient rules and traditions is actually going to spell the end of Latin, because people will not be able to appropriate it on an everyday basis as a vernacular language, and it's slowly going to fall out of prominence and become a dead language, by and large, outside of anything but the Papal States. But we also see a lot of reflection. It's hard not to be reflective. It's hard not to look inward when you are faced with a world that is so frightening outside, when you're faced with Black Death, constant warfare, civil war, you know, religious wars. All of these things are going to be very frightening to people, and many of them start to question themselves and their place in the world. And we're going to see the way that that forms a narrative inside of our humanism, right? The way that we see a narrative of divine inspiration, of epiphany, of these writers experiencing a moment of epiphany with God and applying notions of the godly to statecraft, applying notions of the godly to the way that we view ourselves, because we start to see these renaissances. And there will be multiple renaissances. We have the Northern Renaissance, and we have multiple versions of that. We have the English Renaissance versus the French versus the Spanish versus the Swiss versus the Netherlands, the Dutch Renaissance, and then we have the Polish Renaissance and the Hungarian Renaissance. And all of these are going to be their own phenomenon, very different from the Italian Renaissance. And even at the same time, we see a Renaissance happening in the Muslim world, in the Mughal Empire. So we see all of these things kind of happening at once, and all having the same kind of inspiration, that eye turned inward, self-reflection, seeking to understand a world that has changed. And really, we get this term Renaissance from the people at the time. And one thing to keep in mind is that when Burckhardt coined this term, revival, because what were they reviving? They were reviving those Greco-Roman texts, those Greco-Roman art forms that they were being re-exposed to via the Ottoman Empire and the Golden Horde. Now, though they coined themselves that, they also coined the terms the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages at the same time, because the idea being that they understood all the people before them as being lesser than they were. They saw themselves as exceptional. And we see this interesting exceptionalism cropping up in this most bizarre location at a time of great crises. And it's going to be tied to the way that this movement is patroned, because every great art movement requires backers, it requires patrons. And what we see here is that patrons kind of start to attach the idea of the Renaissance that's happening in their locations, the art and the cultural and the civic and the literary output, as being important factors in what makes their location, their region, their developing sense of nation state, makes these things exceptional and great. And we see this most especially in Italy. Because Italy, along with a number of different locations, but Italy especially, promoted these kinds of regional identity, more personal forms of identity. We saw the communes, right? The commercial quickening that had been the mode and method of mercantilism in Italy become slowly replaced by the signore system, right? The great men. A powerful man ruling over a major clan family name like the Medicis, right? The Medicis being probably one of the most infamous, and rightly so, of these signore families, these great legacy families. They promoted an idea that the places they were from were the best place possible. These folks understood that good old concept of arete. We saw the Florentines competing with the Milanese, with the Venetians, with Genoese, right? We saw these different schools produce different output that was regionally bound. It was very different art in the north than there was in the south than there was in the center. And we see that even the personalization that we have in these nation states and these national and regional senses of identity are further expressed, in addition to the signore system, from even the way that artists saw and represented themselves. Because here we see the personal gaze. Here we have the painter himself painting himself into his own painting that shows the school of Athens, with him next to all of these great minds from the Greco-Roman antiquity age. And he's looking out and making eye contact with you, the audience. It's a very personal moment. It's very intimate. And it personally aggrandizes the artist in a way that had no real historical precedence in the Christian world. In the Christian world, it was not about the personal. It was not about the gaze. It was about that moment when you look up to heaven and think about God and His beauty, but you also think about power and the right order of the world. Now we see people having a playful look at you, the audience. We see in the Italian tradition, to this day actually, to this day this persists in many locations, that it is typical for an Italian painter to have a major flaw in their painting that they put in on purpose. The idea being that only God should create perfection, that we cannot deign to create perfection, so we will sew imperfection into it to show our dutiful obeisance to God. Even in the Broadmoor, you can go and see one of the paintings there, done by an Italian master who still held to that tradition and put in a couple of specific flaws in order to meet that tradition. But now you see, in addition to this kind of godliness, we see the personal, the playful. But the playful came out of a lot of transitional art that very much captured religious themes, intensely religious themes, as we see in Giotti. But as much as Giotti was very religious, it was also very different. He didn't do that kind of non-perspective painting that was so popular in the Gothic style. We see much brighter colors. We see more perspective, more linear layering, right? We see people being layered at different distances. And we see in the Italian Renaissance the persistence of fresco as the major material, the medium that is used. Fresco being tempera paint that is painted onto kind of a wet cement. So it actually sinks into the cement. And in fact, it's a good thick inch of paint sinking into the wall. So even when it starts to chip away, it's got to go down an inch before it loses its color, which is why these art forms have persisted so well throughout the ages. But we see lots of bright colors, and one of the reasons we see some of these colors is because the introduction of trade routes from the east that carried with them lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. And lapis lazuli is really going to be the backbone of these vibrant blues. We might note that in the Middle Ages, in the time just before that, colors had grown certain symbolic meanings. Only certain figures could wear certain colors in the painting because those were symbolic. Blues we would see assigned to Jesus and the direct lineage or family line of people surrounding Jesus. So Mary could wear blue, Jesus could wear blue, but no one else is meant to. We could see purple with regional rulers, people who are secular rulers. But now we see blues being applied to people who aren't really all that holy or all that religious. We see vibrant reds, usually something that would only be worn by people in positions of power, happening with people who wouldn't be considered powerful people. And we see that especially in Masaccio, another one of these great transitional artists that really start to develop some of the styles, especially look at that kind of great shadowing that he uses in the way that we see a kind of distant background. And we see here something that's going to become very important in the Renaissance movement, that though these scenes are religious scenes from the Bible that people would recognize as stories from the ancient past, they were performed in contemporary environments and in contemporary dress. You see, these men here are not dressed as people would have been in biblical times. They're dressed like people of that day. That background that we see there is not the background of some long ago Bethlehem. It's the background of northern Italy. So we see that people are painting themselves, southern Italy, that people are painting their own world into these scenes as a way of kind of reappropriating it. And we see the pride of place that starts to be established even in these paintings. And we see also lots more detail in musculature and in linear perspective especially. And we see this a lot with Michelangelo, who used linear perspective to make just some gorgeous, gorgeous masterpieces. Now, Michelangelo was himself really a sculptor by trade who was forced to do many a painting, and he was never terribly fond of painting. He wasn't really into it. And he got into a lot of arguments with a lot of church patrons who were paying his coffer because the church was very, very, very involved in the Italian Renaissance. As much as the great families, the signores, right, would contribute to the patronage of these artists, they could also be some dangerous cats, and most of them, almost all of them, wove their own power, their own signori power into the power of the church. They would have brothers, cousins, sons who were in the upper echelon of the church authority. So we see this mixture of church and secular patronage, all of it for religious material, because the Italian Renaissance was very highly religious. It had a lot more religious themes than we see in some of the Northern Renaissance. And Michelangelo had a bit of a few pretty good scrapes with his patrons over what he painted and how he painted. One thing that should be noted is that Michelangelo was likely, by all accounts, gay. And he hated painting women. He said so himself. He hated painting women. So what he liked to do is have one of his male models come in, and then he would cut a fruit in half and put the two parts of the fruit on either part of his chest in order to make boobs. There you go. Now you've got a woman, which is why so many of his women look so terribly, terribly masculine. But even his scenes are a little bit unusual. There's a certain sensuousness to his scenes. There's a certain kind of explosive eroticism that you see in a number of his scenes as well, largely because as a sculptor, and when you see his work when it's only partially finished, you see kind of the process that he goes about to arrive at these sculptures, and it's very explosive. It almost seems as though these subjects explode outward from inside of the marble. Some of this marble being imported from Corinth. Remember good old Corinth, the marble makers? They're once again importing marble into Italy to fuel the beautification of the city. And that's exactly what artists like Michelangelo did. But it was not always an easy process. And no more was this true than in the Sistine Chapel. As we said, he didn't really like painting. Michelangelo was not a fan of painting. And the Sistine Chapel was not just a very, 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 very large painting. It was one that was physically crippling as a task. Michelangelo really physically injured himself constantly. It was torturous. He said this himself, that the painting of it was torturous. The conditions under which it occurred were torturous. And his benefactors, his patrons, continued to come in constantly and bitch and moan about the nudity, for example, that he had in the sensuousness of his subject matters. And he got so angry that much of the time he would paint them into the Sistine Chapel itself to show his distaste. And one person that he painted in, Cesano, had complained that there was too much nudity. So what he did in response to that was to paint that man as the king of hell with ass ears and a giant snake apparently eating his penis. Yeah, no nudity though. No nudity. Good job, Michelangelo. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was very different aesthetically and very different methodologically. He loved painting, but his preferred method was also not painting. It was actually being in the laboratory, studying in the laboratory, making beautiful machines. But he did like to paint, and the paintings that he has tends to be far more feminine than what we see in Michelangelo, where Michelangelo kind of represents the masculine ideal of the Roman world. Da Vinci really kind of represents a more feminine sensuousness that we see in the Greek aesthetic, especially in the Hellenistic age. And he also uses a lot of earthen tones, whereas Michelangelo has those bright, vibrant, kind of like Superman colors, right? Like that's the same guy that made the colorist from the Superman comic books. Could have totally been the guy for Michelangelo. You see those bright yellows and reds and blues. And with Da Vinci, you see earth tones. So you see greens and deep ochre blues and browns. And you see the heavy use of shadow to kind of imply mystery, right? The world untouched by the light, the mysterious world. And you see here that we've got Mary with Margaret and Jesus and John the Baptist all hanging out in a cave, a place of mystery, right? So this is a very different aesthetic style that really appealed to the philosophy of a man like Da Vinci More, a man who was a pacifist, and yet in order to pay for his projects, had to design a lot of war machines for great signores who were involved in that massive civil war and in parts of the 100 Years' War. So one thing that he would do so he wouldn't have to violate his moral principles, and this is only something that we've discovered not too long ago, is in each and every one of his war machines he designed in a fatal flaw that would make that war machine useless if it was deployed. So though he made it seem as though he was providing the tools of war, none of them would actually work, which was quite interesting, quite interesting. A man who was definitely innovative and ahead of his time, but a man that kind of turned away from the Roman aesthetic, that was then combined with a new focus on mathematics and linear perspective. And we're going to again revive. The Renaissance is all about that revival. We're going to revive certain concepts from the Roman and the Grecian world. We're going to talk about linear perspective and the golden arch, the S-shaped curve. And all of these things we see in David here and by Michelangelo, where we see these look at those massive, massive hands. He looks like a gorilla, doesn't he? Because if you're looking at him from straight on, he is out of proportion, right? He is disproportionate. But if you were viewing him as you would be, if you were viewing him at that location, you would be viewing him from below. He would be towering above you. And in fact, when you see him from below, the way that Michelangelo cut him made him look completely equiline from top to bottom. So he looked very well proportioned, despite the fact that if you were seeing somebody with normal proportions from below, it distorts the way they look proportionally. If you draw, you know this, that if you show somebody from an angle from below, you have to do all of these little tricks because the proportion is different. Well, he actually took that into account and mathematically proposed some ways around it. And we see this focus combining with the kind of aesthetic of that powerful male body kind of thrusting with dynamic action. Very idealistic. Very, very idealistic. And then we have the other end of that idealism, that Greco-Roman idealism, that kind of sensual male. You know, the curved male that doesn't have too many muscles. You know, this is, and again, we see another David. This is another David. So we have a very different kind of aesthetic here, but they're all following that Greco-Roman tradition of idealism. And they're combining that with a whole heck of a lot of religious themes and artwork that is meant to be displayed in religious places, in religious spaces. So we see with Gentiletta Fabriano, who made his works for inside of chapels and inside of monasteries and convents. And they were gorgeous, gorgeous works, really beautiful and colorful, and in these kind of dark apartment spaces that you would get in a lot of places in Italy, because that's kind of the way it works in parts of Italy. You know, it was that unplanned city. There was an unplanned city. There would be some pretty dark apartments. And just imagine how much more lovely these places would be, these sites would be, with these bright, vibrant golds and blues just kind of shining out from the wall in the form of a fresco. We see that especially with Fra Filippo Lippi, who was famous for going into monasteries in Italy and painting frescoes on the walls that even had the added effect. He would make architecture into his painting, as we see here. He makes it look as though there is an archway that his painting is recessing into. That is in fact all an optical illusion. He did this to create more space, more light, and more beauty, and he says this himself, to create these things inside of these kind of dark, sad places that monasteries were for many people, because like we said, many people who were oblated, who were given over to the monastery, it's not that they wanted to do that, it's that their family had to do that, and they were forced to do that because their family couldn't afford to keep them. And, you know, to introduce this beauty and this light into the lives of people kind of desperately living in a world that they could not control was such a boon. However, that was mixing with some other things that were going to create some serious tensions and anxiety, especially because we're still in the world of the Black Death. We're still in the world of the Great Schism and the Avignon Papacy. We're in a world turned topsy-turvy. And one of the few times, some of the few times that artists strayed from religious scenes in the Italian Renaissance was for these, I mean, if they're reviving the Greco-Roman world, of course they would revive these Greco-Roman stories, because now they're getting exposure to pagan stories that weren't allowed in the Christian world before then, that weren't really interesting to Christians before then. And we see that with Botticelli and Da Vinci, who had very pagan themes as well as religious themes, Botticelli especially, as we see here with a scene of Aphrodite rising up. And this is basically the birth of Aphrodite into the world. We have these major characters who would be seen as pagan characters, and yet Botticelli kind of does an interesting job in adding certain visual features that would be recognizable symbolically to a Christian, because after all, the people who are blowing Aphrodite to shore so she could be covered in this bright, vibrant red cloak, right, look a little bit like angels, and they're wearing blue, that symbolically holy color. Inasmuch as this work is absolutely probably one of the most beautiful pieces in the Italian Renaissance, works like this inspired a lot of fear and anxiety in a world of the danse macabre, in a world where death came for everyone. And we see this reflected in the bonfires of the vanities. There's a number of these events all throughout Europe, including many northern European states outside of Italy, though they were much more popular in Italy and Spain. These were usually guided and propagandized by charismatic figures who would come through preaching reform, damnation, sin, and our saving. Like, how do we save ourselves as a people from all of this horror? Well, we have to turn back to God. And look at these pagan things. Look at the way you're all celebrating this worldly pagan idea. Look at the way that you're turning away from God. Look at the way that you're turning to money instead of turning to your faith. And Girolamo Savonarola was an Italian charismatic preacher who was a reform preacher. He's in one of these many kind of reform schools of monks who wanted people to be simpler because they believed that this is why the Black Death came for us. This is why these disasters were being meted down upon our heads. And he was able to convince a number of people in Italy to burn their own artwork and their books in a bonfire of the vanity. And that is how we lost most of the work of Botticelli. And had it not been for one of his friends just thinking, good God, what would happen if all of this work burnt up? And he went into his art studio and saved a number of Botticelli's work. And he even describes this moment as being so horrible and painful because he has to make the choice of which of these, of the great masters' excellent paintings, just amazing, gorgeous paintings, is he going to save. Luckily, we got the last one. We got our Aphrodite, but it was a difficult choice, and he was not able to escape with many, and Botticelli himself took his own work to the bonfire of vanities. So too did Fra Filippo Lippi. They took their own work and burned it in flames in order to save us all from eternal damnation and the continued punishment of an angry God. Because after all, we can keep returning to this idea of Hieronymus Bosch and this other panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights, where the thing that can save us, the thing that can keep us from excess or from death, is God and the grace of God. And we see this reflected in the Southern Renaissance, but we're also going to see some of those themes present in the North. But we're going to see some major differences as well. And a lot of this has to do with all those things that we discussed earlier on when we discussed that tension that's been rising between secular and religious authorities. The princes won in the North. They won. And so we're going to see princes, we're going to see powerful patrons represented in personal photos. We're going to see incredible amounts of realism, lots and lots of realism, right? Attention to minute details, less religious themes. Because in the North, there was a different series of concerns, as we see here with Albrecht Dürer, who had much of his career be paid for by a few very powerful lords and ladies whom he would paint for. Because if you were anybody at this age, you would have your own court painter. All great kings and queens had their own court painter. They had their own courtly artists. Every great household commissioned an artist at some time to paint a portrait for them. This was a different kind of patronage system that wasn't attached to the power of the church, because the signories attached their power to the church. They still weeded their sons and daughters and cousins and nephews into the higher echelon of church authority. So their power may have been secular, but it was also guided and tied and interwoven with a religious authority. Not so in the North, where religious authority was taking a back seat to princely authority. And we can see this expression of realism here in Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck has such an expressive amount of detail, just how real certain parts of his scene look, like how realistic the lighting is. It's not made for effect or drama. It's meant to be realistic. It's supposed to look like what happens when the sunlight comes in at this very particular angle. But we also see here that we have a religious scene. We have the religious scene of Mary, and then we have a secular ruler here on the right, don't we? Who is this princely guy tipping his hat to Mary? Who is this fellow holding glasses, by the way? Glasses, an invention that had only come to be in the age of Galileo with developments of optics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. These were brand new devices, right? He's holding a book, the kind of book that people didn't have in the days of Mary and the baby Jesus. And we have men who were dressed in the clothing of authority of that current day and age. Again, we see these classical scenes reinvented in the garb and in the customs of that day and age. And we see a nod to secular rulers. And we see even the backgrounds being expressive of the backgrounds you would see in this current day and age. But one thing that we see here constantly is paper, books, the text, right? Here in Roger van der Weyden, we see a man dressed as a holy leader would be at that day and age in the Netherlands, holding a book, looking out over a view that would be contemporary to his age, with people standing, viewing that view themselves in the modern garb of the day, but always carrying a book, always carrying a book. And again, you can see some further reading there, because when we get into next chapter, into chapters 14 and 15, we're going to see this tradition of the text. We're going to see this humanistic movement that has been really demanding that people read the Bible for themselves, throw some serious wrenches into the power of the Catholic Church at a time when it is at its weakest, after a great schism, after a period of crisis, after multiple kind of secular religious wars that ended with religion kind of losing. All of this is going to culminate in a Reformation and then a Catholic Reformation movement. We're going to have people split off from the Catholic Church, largely because of the power systems developed at this time. So this is what we're going to kind of prepare for in the next chapter. I would super recommend reading David Herlihy's The Black Death and the Transformation of the West if you are interested in seeing some great stuff on epidemiological history. If you're into the artwork, I would definitely check out some of these articles on the Renaissance so you can get visual and primary sources and lots of good paintings where they kind of break down the symbolic meaning of certain things, and it's fabulous. If you're interested in this subject, I would super recommend it. So I will see you guys back here on your streaming lectures for chapter 14 and 15, which we're going to scrunch just the same way we did this one. And do make sure that if you're in the military course that you go to the discussion board on Saturday and answer some of the questions there. Ask a few questions yourself about the subject matter of this chapter. Make some connections, just the way we do when we're in class and you guys have comments. When you're listening to your lectures, write them down and then put them into those discussions, okay? So I will see you guys on the discussion boards and have an excellent day.